I want to welcome everybody to this third Career Accelerator lecture series presented by the Engineering Advisory Board for the School of Engineering. My name is Bob Parsons. I'm a professor in civil, environmental, and architectural engineering, and I'm the moderator today. And it's my pleasure to welcome Kyle Mathis of Chevron Phillips, who's with us to present. Kyle has 30 years of leadership experience in the petrochemical industry. He currently serves as the general manager of the alpha olefins business at Chevron Phillips Chemical Company. This business has assets in the U.S. Gulf Coast, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar at an annual revenue of $1 billion. Kyle began his career with Phillips 66 in 1990 and joined the Chevron Phillips Chemical Company joint venture in 2000. Prior to his current role, Kyle served as managing director of strategic transactions, where he was responsible for the company's acquisition and disposition activities. Throughout his career, he has had roles in production and process engineering, sales, product management, business development and planning, and general management of CP Chemical's global styrenics and engineering polymers businesses. Kyle has a BS in chemical engineering from here at the University of Kansas and an MBA from the University of Houston. He is a Dean's Engineering Advisory Board member at the University of Kansas, and prior to that spent 22 years on the Chemical and Petroleum Engineering Advisory Board. He's married to Karan, who's the Assistant General Counsel and Chief IP Counsel for BP. Outside of work, they both enjoy traveling, golfing, and spending time with friends. And he's here to present on environmental, ethical, and legal responsibilities in the engineering profession. And I would say, at this point, we would all clap and welcome him, but that's a little difficult on Zoom. In any case, we want to welcome Kyle. And for our audience, we want to welcome you. And we want to say your questions are an important part of this process. The way this is going to work is Kyle's going to go ahead and present. When he's done, we'll have a question time. So your questions, if you send them in on chat, I'll be collecting those throughout the presentation and grouping them. And I'll probably ask we'll have some common questions, and I'll group them and ask them as a common question. Please send your questions in. That has really been an informative, entertaining, interesting part of the presentation. So we'll have 15 minutes of questions or so, 15, 20 minutes at the end, and that'll be it. If you have to leave early, that's fine. The recording will be available both through Zoom and also on the School of Engineering webpage, where we also have the recordings from the previous two lectures. And I encourage you to check that out. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kyle, and you're welcome to share your screen and go for it.
Perfect. Well, first of all, thanks, Bob. Everybody let me know if this is sharing properly. There we go. Everybody see the first slide?
Yes, we can see. Actually, we're seeing your screen where we're seeing the notes as well.
That's not good. Let me just put it in presentation mode then. Is that full screen now?
I'm not seeing your screen at all at this point.
Okay. How's that?
Still not seeing your screen.
Well, I tell you what.
You were sharing a minute ago.
Let me
try to share again. Try to share again like you did the first time, and then go to presentation mode.
This all worked on the trial run. Great. Sorry, folks. Okay.
Is it giving you any kind of feedback?
Well,
There you, okay, now we are back where you were. So we see the slide and the notes. Now, could you go to presentation mode?
so it's not allowing me to go to, it's just showing you the notes, huh?
Well, no, we're seeing the slides. So we can see the slides, but we're also seeing your notes.
Oh, that's not too good. Why don't
Okay,
we,
now that's making it bigger. So,
all right, let's just get going. I think if you can see most of the screen now, are we good?
we see your slide, and then we see a few options you have, like it says slide 1 to 29, but otherwise, that's it.
For some reason, it's not pulling up the main slide, but we'll go with this. This will work fine.
Okay.
So first of all, thanks to everybody here for your time. I appreciate the opportunity to present to this group. I noticed that Pat and Rich were on, which they set the bar high for the first two presentations, and hopefully everybody had a chance to listen to theirs because they were well done.
Hey, Kyle, sorry to interrupt you, but I've got a note from a helper who says if he goes to the display settings in PowerPoint top bar, in PowerPoint top bar, he can change the screen.
I'm
So
gonna keep going because
okay, that's fine.
Clearly don't want to hold us up here. If you guys can see the slides, we're good.
Okay.
So before I get started here, I just wanted to share a little bit of my career journey before we get into the material. I grew up in Bartlesville, Oklahoma, and spent a good portion of my youth there, certainly through my high school years. And my father was a first generation in his family to attend college and paved the way for my education by getting a PhD at the University of Kansas in organic chemistry. And I was a fiercely independent young man and was determined not to follow in his footsteps, but I didn't manage to stray too far, obviously, with getting a chemical engineering degree here at KU. I looked at quite a few schools, but KU certainly won me over, and so I lost that independence battle there pretty quickly. But I did switch career paths. I started as a pre-med and intended to stay away from chemistry, but chemical engineering drew me back. When I finally decided to accept a job offer, I ended up going to work for Phillips Petroleum Company, which is where he spent most of his entire career. So there was certainly no getting away from his legacy, and I couldn't have made better choices along the way, and for that I'm very grateful. I tell you all of this just to honor my father to start with, but give you the confidence, those of you in the engineering school there, that regardless of where your current thoughts are about your career, that you have certainly chosen a good path so far. I think back about the time I had at the University of Kansas, and particularly in the engineering program, and I'm reminded of how well I was prepared to enter the workforce then and advance through my career. As I look at the engineers from the University of Kansas my company has hired over the years, since I graduated many years ago, you can be assured that your engineering programs are preparing you well to enter the workforce and accelerate your career. Those that do know me well know that I bleed crimson and blue, and the University of Kansas has been very good to me, and I enjoy giving back. And I encourage each of you students to stay engaged with the university as you and your engineering program as appropriate in whatever capacity that works for you. I get excited every time I'm able to engage in helping KU grow and prosper with the opportunities like this series. So do what you can when you certainly move on from school. I also want to acknowledge what it must be like returning to your studies in an environment like this. I know it has been a challenge for me at my workplace and in company to find some normalcy and manage through the challenges that we are all facing. And hopefully you can find this lecture series particularly timely in this environment as we attempt to return to the new normal. So with that, let me start with a quick who we are, meaning Chevron Phillips. That's the company I've worked for 30 years of my career. The heritage of our company is come together from Chevron and Phillips years ago in 2000 when we formed, and we're 20 years running. It's a very unique circumstance that we would be a 20-year joint venture in the Fortune 500 space, specifically as large as we've become. But it's working out well, and it serves our business well. And you notice the tagline, performance by design, caring by choice. That's really speaks to who we are, and resonates well. A little bit about where we're located. We clearly a global company, 31 manufacturing and research centers around the world. You can see well represented in our space, and growing. A little bit about the businesses that are under our umbrella. We have about 8 businesses that we have under the tent. The largest 3 are the top polyolefins, olefins, and alpha olefins, and then those serve the supply chains beyond that. Very proud of our technology. We're the largest the high density polyethylene producer in the world, and have a lot of licensing and process technology in other spaces as well. I think in this environment, it goes without saying how important safety is in terms of a culture in anything we do in our life, but certainly we're very proud of our safety culture and the reductions that we've had since formation. And all of our facilities are OSHA Voluntary Protection Program star sites, which we achieved early in our joint venture, and we're very proud of that. Sustainability is a cornerstone of our strategy as well. That's obviously something we're going to spend some more time talking about in this presentation. But I wanted to just let you know where we stood on it. It's something that we're building into our strategy, both in our plastic circular view of the economy, but also in everything we do from a project environment standpoint. We've got sustainability metrics, and it's certainly important as we bring capital projects forward to show how they uphold in the sustainability space. You're seeing and hearing an awful lot about this in the market today around big oil and how companies are reinventing themselves in this space. I think anybody graduating in this environment, this would be a very important topic for you in understanding how this space, how your opportunities look in the workforce. Obviously, we take this very seriously in the petrochemical industry. Okay, so what will we discuss today? For those of you that listen to Rich and Pat's talks on teamwork and leadership, this presentation is timely because the key elements that we will discuss today are going to be positively or negatively influenced by the kind of leadership and team engagement in your own workplace, and specifically with how you're engaged with both of them. So as I started to put this talk together, I realized early on it was going to be pretty difficult to create the kind of inspiring message that Rich and Pat were able to convey with their respective journeys on leadership and teamwork. The last thing you need to hear from me at 4 p.m. on Wednesday is a preacher here talking about mundane topics, but I do appreciate those that tuned in. I think you will hear some things that feel a little preachy, but at some point, these are very important topics that you're going to encounter throughout your career, and I think deserve the time here. You may have heard some expressions already, or you certainly will in your career likely, that say something like, you've already checked the smart box. And what that means is that you don't really need to prove to anyone how smart you are anymore. That might represent that you've adequately cemented your IQ, but I would suggest that to flourish and move forward in your career, you're going to need to focus on your EQ, which is referred to as the emotional quotient. And we talk about the EQ as a measure of emotional intelligence, which really can be measured by four main pillars: high self-awareness, the conduct of self-management, which is really about your ability to rein yourself in, social awareness, and excelling at relationship management. And I would suggest that many of the points that we're going to discuss today really fall into this EQ category. So keep that in mind. Oops, a little ahead of myself here. So what are, for starters, giving this talk to a group of engineers, many of the things that we are going to talk about are appropriate for all aspects of the workforce and business, and included in general. So this is certainly going to have an angle to engineers for sure, but it's important in the business environment as in general. When I was at KU, we had an ethics course in the engineering curriculum, and that touched on some of these topics. And I'm sure that the current ethics program class that you or will take has evolved over the time with the times for sure. I'd say in our current litigious society that the importance of each of these topics is paramount. So let's talk about some of the categories here. Effective communications. We're going to spend a fair amount of time here. While this may seem like common sense to some, it's amazing how many times I see issues here with this, not only with new employees, but certainly those well in their career. So let this soak in as basic as it may sound. We're going to touch on some legal responsibilities, ethics and integrity. Again, this may sound like common sense, but it's certainly worth diving into, and there are many dimensions to this one. Commitment to the environment and sustainability. And then we'll talk about throughout the whole presentation some examples of good and bad behaviors. So let's picture a billboard on the side of the road, and I won't read this specifically, but this may refer to a person you know, or God forsake, and it's not yourself. But if that was posted on a billboard, I think this would be concerning, to say the least. As we think about how we communicate, we should start with how we spend our time, in which that includes communications. If you're not comfortable with something being published on the record or put on a billboard, then you're probably misusing the internet and in not communicating responsibly. So that is just a kind of a precursor to this space. So bad behavior in our communications. Again, I'll try to limit my preachiness here, but main topics are these types of things are inappropriate, they're irresponsible, and they're even illegal at times. They can happen anywhere at any time. The internet's just one place you can make mistakes. A quickly written email can create inadvertent disclosure of material and or create a binding contract. A careless conversation with a competitor over drinks can result in antitrust violations. And there are many ways we can innocently violate the law, and despite our best efforts to remain in compliance. And I think the best way maybe to talk through some of these is some examples. So here are some things that either you may be aware of from what you've read, or at least worth talking about. A teacher that was suspended without pay. Basically, a teacher was on her own work and life blog, and she called her students bad names and described one as whiny, grade grubber with unrealistic high expectations of their ability. She was suspended with pay. The superintendent reported the incident could result in termination. So just somebody blogging in their own space outside the work environment, not a good outcome. An unhappy tenant sued for libel. We'll talk about that concept in a minute, but tweeting to her mere 20 followers that her apartment was moldy. The landlord filed a complaint in Chicago, which argues that anybody in the world could view the account holder's tweets, and basically she was charged with libel for simply a tweet to a small amount of people. And then a marketer, this one, this hit the press in a pretty big way. A Detroit MBA student was fired um, from his dream job working for a marketing firm hired by Chrysler because he sent out a tweet including a nasty word. And he intended to have been using his own Twitter account, but posted the rant on the fellow Chrysler's official Twitter account. He was fired by the marketing contractor, and then the contractor was fired by Chrysler. So again, just careless activities that can result in bad outcomes. So this is some basics here, but I think it's useful if you don't think about how you write and what you're trying to say. These are some common mistakes we see in our space, and again, by all levels of employees. And you're trying to convey the same message in every one of these cases. It's just how you choose to write your words. We misrepresented the facts as opposed to a customer alleges that we misrepresented the facts. We shipped the wrong product. The customer reported we shipped the wrong product. Am I leaving inaccuracies uncorrected? I don't agree versus I hear you're frustrated. So again, it's semantics here, but it's just careful communications can mean an awful lot in terms of how we communicate it internally and externally. As I was looking through preparatory material, I ran across an article that Forbes had put out in early 2018, and this to me was appropriate. Here's 10 things to never put in writing, and I think this is appropriate for both internal and external communications. No criticism, even in jest. Jokes or humorous stories that are risque. Obviously, things like romantic thoughts, your frustration with your own manager, gossip. Again, these are pretty common sense. Confidential proprietary information, threats, discussion of illegal activities, your job search plans, or any message or sentiment you would not to have happy for executives to read. Again, very basic things that most would find to be common sense, but you'd be surprised the number of folks that don't do a good job of transitioning from their personal lives to their work lives when it comes to communications inside the workplace. And again, some of these are useful outside the workplace too, in terms of what not to do. So remember that once an email or a text is posted, it's out of your control. There's no way to pull it back. And just because it's informal doesn't mean it's binding. Use clear, precise language and act professionally. And then I think the one that we can all relate to in any aspect in our lives is the reply all button. That doesn't necessarily result in bad activity, but generally replying all is never a good case. So let's focus on some positives in the communication space. When you're writing and you're trying to convey a message, state the purpose of what you're writing about right up front within the first 2 lines of the message. Don't count on the recipients to read to the end to figure out what you want to convey. Use a concise and specific subject line. That subject line helps readers prioritize the messages and find them later. And if your message is especially important, then consider putting important or respond needed in the subject line. Limit your email to one topic only. This may not seem obvious, but when you cover multiple topics in a single message, you risk burying important information and not really getting your point across clearly. Be courteous. We're all in a hurry, but it doesn't take too long to type please or thank you, and you'll get better results. And then be discreet about the content. It doesn't seem to matter how many times people hear this advice. There's always someone in the news learning the hard way by having their emails subpoenaed, or plastered all over the front page of the newspaper. So don't ever put anything in an email that you would be uncomfortable sharing with the entire world. And I would say, you know, from a practical perspective in my career, when you talk about what gets put in print, this has to do with societal changes. You see more and more people comfortable tweeting and emailing than picking up the phone and talking ear to ear or face to face. And I think the best advice remains in our world is keeping it out of print. Even good communications, unless they need to be memorialized, is always a much better thing to just talk to someone than write it down. Again, I try not to be preachy here, but anything put in print not only becomes discoverable, but it becomes a huge, huge cost to discover if there's ever anything that goes wrong. And the amount of money that's spent in corporate America going out and doing a discovery work on everything written and everything in a file is absolutely amazing. So best guidance here would be limit what you put in print, talk in person, and then be very careful when you do put things in print and make sure it follows the guidelines we've talked about. So let's change gears here a little bit. I'm going to talk about some legal responsibilities in the workplace, and I want to start by saying I'm not an attorney and I'm not giving legal advice here. I am married to one, and my brother's an attorney, so I feel like I live in that space most of the time. But my wife was sure to make sure that I had to state I was not an attorney before I dove into this. This, again, is not an area that I would say is specific to engineering per se, but it's certainly important. And most of your companies that you're going to go work for are going to have an effective training program that deals with most of this. And so I would not expect this to be a surprise when you get out into the work world. Let's go down the list here. Libel, that's simply a defamation by written or printed words. And again, we've talked a little bit about that. Be very careful what you put in print. Anything that is defamatory or maliciously or damaging represents, that your words represent could be construed as libel, and you could be held accountable for that. The anti-competitive behavior, this could be a discussion that took months. There are so many angles to this one. I'm going to try to stick to the top level of things that are important here. You may or may not have studied this, but in 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act, and in 1914, two more additional acts, the Federal Trade Commission Act, which became and established the FTC, and then the Clayton Act were formed. And with some revisions, these are the three core federal antitrust laws that are still in force today, that guide what we do, can and can't do. And we've obviously got to be very careful what we do and say to customers and with customers and competitors. This again has a root in terms of the communication aspect we just talked about, but this gets into a lot more detail around, again, the illegal activities. Antitrust laws are there to protect against price fixing, bid rigging, market allocation, and illegal boycotts. All of those are serious, and the violations bring massive consequences. And clearly, these are not things that you're likely to encounter right in the throes of the beginning of your career, but it's certainly something you need to be aware of. In an investigator's mind, an illegal collaboration may be suggested by simply innocent records like travel and expense reports, emails, telephone records. All of these can appear to document an opportunity for companies to illegally work together on pricing and bids. So a pattern of suspicious pricing behavior to emerge. Any of these pieces of evidence might be used to argue that an organization's actions are not independent, but result of agreement with a competitor. So this again is common sense. One of the biggest areas I see where this can impact people that you wouldn't even think twice about is if you're going out with your friends that you might be living in the same town with for a beer that work for competitors, and you're sharing some information that you shouldn't be sharing. It may seem like innocent work talk or after work talk, but that kind of activity is illegal. And so be very, very careful how you handle yourself, especially if you're in the same industry with any of your colleagues. There's a couple of examples here that are worth mentioning. The DOJ, Department of Justice, is prosecuted a lot of people in these spaces. I'm sure the things that make the headlines you've read your own versions of. Microsoft was charged in Europe for 3 antitrust areas for a total of $2.1 billion for their abuses of their market position. And the 3 areas were refusal to provide information to competitors that would allow them to make their hardware and software compatible with Microsoft. You'd think, well, that might be considered just a competitive advantage, but that was deemed actually an antitrust violation. The fact that Windows Media Player included as part of the bundle with the Windows operating system, it damaged for-profit streaming services. And then Microsoft's heavy-handedness in steering Windows users towards their own internet browser rather than allowing users a free choice for a browser to use. That cost Microsoft $2.1 billion in the courts in Europe because of antitrust activities. Drug companies, you see stories about drug companies. Hoffman Roche was charged $500 million for price fixing and market allocation around vitamin sales. $500 million, that's enough to make a big damage to the bottom line. And then we think of something like OPEC, who manages, you guys have an understanding of who OPEC is. It's in some people's minds, a cartel. It certainly doesn't meet the US standards of antitrust in terms of coordination and cooperation on oil pricing, but that is something that is a slippery slope in my mind. It lives and breathes behind us, and it's acceptable in some countries and in some parts of the world for that to occur. This is very much against how the United States antitrust laws work. And I guess I'll give a couple of examples without endangering people or names that in my own career. I've been in certain circumstances overseas sitting at a table negotiating and actually been offered things that were anti-competitive in order to make business deals occur. And you obviously have to remove yourself from that situation very quickly. You have to report it. You have to let everyone in your own company understand if you find yourself in a situation like that, what's occurred, and use your good training as best you can if you find yourself in a circumstance like that. That's happened to me several times in my career. Let's move on to the next area, inadvertent disclosure of company confidential information. That one should be pretty obvious as well. According to one survey, 33% of the employees admit to sending confidential company information through email, including client lists, technical details, product specs, financial statements. You're going to be in the throes of the beginning of your career, touching lots of confidential things. And you're going to have good training to make sure you understand what you can send and what you can't. And again, should be common sense, but this can create big problems. Don't discuss in public places things that are confidential. Keep paperwork locked away. Shred sensitive documents. Mark paperwork as confidential. And more today, use encryption software that your company obviously might have in place. Moving files around, that's important. There's also something called a non-disclosure agreement. Make sure you use those as appropriate if you have that opportunity. A lot of the areas you see violations here are around stealing of companies' intellectual property. And you've read there's a lot of this that's occurring across countries, and you have to be very careful within your own company that information that's being shared with joint ventures that you might have with other countries is very much following the company confidential. Sometimes the line is clear who you're sending something to, if you're allowed to. Again, you should have good training within your companies here that grounds you in this area. Copyright violations. This is something that there's no doubt I have violated inadvertently in my personal life, and I'm sure others have as well. Just because you can find it on the internet or read it in a publication does not mean it can be copied into a PowerPoint and included in an email without careful thought. Much of the information in the internet, in books and other newspapers is protected by copyright laws. So something as simple as taking a picture off the internet and putting it in a presentation that you might give that then gets published and gets sent forward. Make sure you're using images that have been blessed as either free or that your organization is cleared to use. Again, this is important, internal and external to your work environment. Again, much of this is assigned to artistic works and things, but there's an awful lot of copyright laws that you can violate in the workplace too, with branding and things that have become the art of your intellectual property. And then the waiver of attorney-client privilege, this one's a little bit more complicated to understand, but it's probably something just to touch on. What is privileged? The communications must be, to be privileged, must be confidential, and they must be between a lawyer and a client or their representatives, and in furtherance of giving or seeking legal advice. A lot of people would assume if I want attorney-client privilege to exist on communications, all I've got to do is slap a attorney-client privilege on the top of my email or correspondence, and make sure there's an attorney on the email distribution list. That doesn't hold. It needs to be significant in the sense that it's furtherance of giving or seeking legal advice. So it can't just be I'm throwing that banner on there to protect myself from anything that's going on in this conversation. Again, this is a little bit more deeper in terms of the subtleties, but again, hopefully your training programs that you'll have at your workplace will get into the details here. So let's move on to the next category, ethics and integrity. I'm not going to read all of these, but these to me really spoke to me as far as a good starting points on what is behind ethics and integrity. You can tell I'm a big Warren Buffett fan. I think I'll start with those. In looking for people to hire, you look at the three qualities: integrity, intelligence, and energy. And if they don't have the first, the other two will kill you. It takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to ruin it. If you think about that, you'll do things differently. And integrity is a reputational advantage that others will weigh in subsequent dealings. I think those are all very sound points. Again, much of what we're talking about today you might think of as common sense, but there's a lot of grayness in this world in terms of ethics and integrity. And when we choose who we're going to do business with and who our partners choose who they're going to do business with, this area, at least with the good business partners, pops its head up to the very top. You want to know that you're being received in high regard here, and you certainly want to associate yourself with others that are in high regard here. So as we move forward, keep those in mind. So when we think of ethics, we may think immediately about company compliance and code of conduct. And it's important, but every company will most definitely have a code of conduct, and you'll hopefully be indoctrinated in that very quickly when you onboard. What we're going to spend time on here is more about how engineers specifically should think about their obligations in the profession and the repercussions if they don't communicate, behave, act, or respond appropriately. So we all make mistakes. What's important is that we acknowledge and learn from them, and basically incorporate them into the next thing you do, because the consequences can be bad and even deadly. So to help us keep on track, we need something that's going to present us with a sense of morality and a set of best practices for doing good in the world. We need ethics, and specifically here, engineering ethics. With so many different fields in engineering, it's good to have some common ground, a general set of guidelines or ideas on how engineers should behave and should go about solving problems. Engineering ethics is the study of values, issues, and decisions that are involved with the work of the engineers. So here, what you see on the slide is the fundamental canons for the Code of Ethics for Engineers, is published by the National Society of Professional Engineers. So this is more general. You'll see these same types of codes throughout other specific engineering disciplines, but I think this hits the high points. I think an example is when you swallow a pill for your own health, you need to be able to trust that the people that came up with that formulation had your best interests in mind. And when you look to drive over a bridge, you need to know that the civil engineer who designed it took the time to make it sturdy. And with the foods you eat and the cars you drive and the wires in your home, that they all need to be designed with ethics and safety in mind. So I think that should speak to all the engineering disciplines clearly. So when we look at the primary causes of engineering disasters, and that's kind of a stark way to turn the page here, but it's really probably the most important piece to talk about. Is these are the factors that are involved: human factors, both ethical and accidents, design flaws, material failures, extreme conditions or environments, and in most cases, a combination of the three reasons. I think it's important to point out here that while the point here deals with disasters, it should be obvious that all of these can result in bad outcomes short of anything catastrophic. Certainly enough to cause damage, contaminate a system of the environment, injure someone, or violate some level of compliance. So even with properly designed systems, plants, etc., poor operating behaviors in the alignment with most of these points will result in bad outcomes. So we can start by talking about disasters, but this is really about general operating behavior to start with. An older study, but I think still relevant today, conducted at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich, analyzed 800 cases of structural failure in which 504 people were killed, 594 people were injured, and millions of dollars of damage incurred. When the engineers themselves were at fault, the researchers classified the causes of failure as follows. And so I'm not going to read all of those, but it's clear that there are many reasons here for human error, and insufficient knowledge can result from someone operating outside of their own competency, poor training, or inexperience. The other variations on the theme are the others below that are all variations on the theme. And I'd say let's hold that thought for a moment. In a minute, we're going to talk about what I'm going to call the tenets of operation, which is something specific to our business. I think every company would have something similar, but it will get at canons around how we should operate and put thought into design and operations in anything we do. So let me show my age a little bit here. Most of you have probably heard of all of these in some way, shape, or form, but I decided when my wife told me to remove the Ford Pinto example because none of the students here would have a clue what I'm talking about. So I at least thought I'd put a picture of a Ford Pinto up there that was legally pulled off the internet. to give you an idea what a fine looking car that was back in 1971. It basically was a defective, the point here in terms of the exploding fuel tank was it was a defective fuel system design. The root cause of this was a cost benefit analysis was done internal to Ford, and they determined not to upgrade the fuel system based upon the cost benefit analysis. And 27 people died in rear end collisions because of that over time, and obviously fines were paid, and again, people lost their lives. The Hyatt Regency Hotel walkway collapse, that was just down the road from you guys there in Lawrence. I think most people around the area would certainly remember that. It was in Crown Center that is now the Sheraton, but it was the Hyatt Regency at the time. A fourth floor walkway in the hotel collapsed on the second floor walkway. 114 people were killed. The issue here was contractors at the last minute, after the original design had been baked, decided to change it. And instead of having supports that connected all the way through the fourth and the second floor, they separated those supports, and that basically put excess loading on joints that weren't designed appropriately. It doubly loaded the connection points. And again, the investigation also found that design changes, poor communication, poor or no calculations, and general negligence contributed to the collapse. Unbelievably, at times, design changes were confirmed over the phone rather than checking the documentation or calculations. So that was a terrible. I won't talk about Bhopal. That's been in the books. Everybody knows of that in that sense. I think that the Challenger and the Columbia accidents have been well publicized, as well as of what those stood for. Obviously, NASA has had a complete shakeup based upon the circumstances that happened here. The big point of one of these two was not only concerns around the original incident, but how it was trying to be covered up at the end. We had in the disaster review, a commission member, Richard Feynman, was a Nobel Prize winning physicist. He'd written a section in the final report known as Chapter F, and the commission chairman was furious and asked him to rewrite his section because it shined such a bad light on the space agency, and he felt like it would destroy public confidence. Feynman refused to rewrite, saying his ethics were being compromised, and he threatened to resign if he didn't have his name removed or allow the report to be published in its entirety. It was ultimately published as a part of a lengthy appendix, but was it ethical to force a commission member to remove his analysis from a public report about a publicly funded organization? So lots of learnings there in the space agency. BP Texas City, BP Deepwater Horizon. You both read about those. Lots of things went wrong there. People lost their lives. The Deepwater Horizon incident has reshaped BP as a company. $60 billion through 2008 is what it has cost BP to recover from that incident. Two other parties involved, Transocean paid $1.4 billion fine, and Halliburton paid a $1.1 billion fine. And 11 people died and 17 people were injured. So significant incident. And I won't talk about the General Motors situation. So let's move on to environmental responsibilities. I mentioned the tenants earlier. I'm guessing that when we talk about operating tenants, this again is something that I feel like will speak to folks that enter most any walk of engineering life. You can see these tenants here that I've listed have an angle to environmental as well as operational. And that's really what I'm trying to focus on here in the environmental space, is that while we have tenets of operation that specifically deal with all of our right to work opportunities. And if you see it, you own it, and involve all the right people and all the right SMEs, it also heavily leans on the environmental space. And again, this is our own homegrown culture here at CP Chem that we use these tenants. I've not listed all of them, just the ones that respond to the environmental aspect, but want to highlight how important that is to us and should be to the industry, that we talk about environmental as much as we talk about safety and operational issues. So a couple of things about the tenants. We have 10 of them. I've listed again 4. They are an extension of our values and principles that apply to all employees. They're our code of conduct, and they'll affect the way that all of our daily decisions are handled. They include including any ambiguous situations that arise. So any deviation from always or never in the tenants requires immediate action to counteract the risk, including contentious monitoring or management of change with a risk assessment involving the appropriate subject matter experts. Tenants are intended to protect the people, the environment, and the equipment based on 3 common sense principles. Work safely or not at all. There is always time to do something right, and if it's worth doing, do it better. So that is how we talk about the environmental space in our company. I think something that's, again, we talked on at the very beginning of the talk about sustainability, how important that is to us as well. Sustainability in definition is it's about what we all do, the choices we all make collectively. And it's about how many Earths it would take if everybody in the world lived at the same standard of living as we do. So it's about collective action. And there's 2 main points to make here before I talk about a specific area that's near and dear to me. Is what's the definition of value in how it relates to sustainability? Value changes over time, and it isn't the same for all people. What is the value of wood, trees, stable environment, clean air? Why doesn't the market take care of the environment? Markets set prices, and people set value. So I think that helps define why we're in this gray area when it comes to valuing sustainability. And then the second point is the distribution of cost versus benefit. We tend to act differently in groups versus when we own something ourselves. So the tragedy of the commons, if you've heard of that, is it's a shared resource is gradually depleted by humans beings acting solely on their own interests. So what do we do? What we do in groups relative to what we do as individuals is really the challenge here. Just a quick example, if you go to lunch and you know that the group will split the bill evenly, you may feel freer to order something more expensive than if you were paying it your own way. So we may overconsume things that we share, and emissions, as one example, are something that we share. So that's just to kind of set up, what is our obligation in this space in terms of sustainability. You've heard me talk about how important it is to our company, but I wanted to pivot, I guess, to an area that is critical to our industry, the one I'm in, but should also resonate to all of you that see this in the news every day. And this deals with post-consumer plastics in our environment. This is an issue that is being taken very seriously by our industry. This topic touches on ethics as well as obvious economic impacts. And I think it's worth saying that you've seen lots of both sides of this issue in the press. You've seen lots of pictures like the one you're seeing here. And again, this industry is taking it seriously. And I'll tell you per se how we are and how the industry is dealing with it. According to the World Economic Forum, about 90% of the plastic polluting our oceans is carried by just 10 rivers. in Asia, 8 of them in Asia and 2 of them in Africa. Two things in all the rivers that have in common is the population living in that area and a poor waste management system. So it's an easy thing to say in our industry, hey, all that pollution that you're seeing in the ocean is really overseas, it's somewhere else, it's someone else's issue to take care of. It's clear it's not going to take care of itself without involvement and money in a big way. So clearly, this is an issue that has become even more important, will continue to be more important, and you should know about in terms of how we're handling it. In spite of vocal opposition, public demand for plastic continues to outpace GDP. And so we have a dilemma in the plastics industry. How do we keep producing and making, and how do we then responsibly clean things up? So I'm going to just talk briefly because we're running here to time and I want to make sure we've got good time for questions. There's a lot of different ways to approach the problem. Recycling is one of them. We spend a lot of time in this industry looking at economic ways to recycle, but even practical ways to recycle at every level. We also realize that recycling isn't going to solve the problem. We agree that plastics just do not belong in our environment ever. And again, you've seen a couple of really impactful pictures here. And I just wanted to let you know this industry embraces this issue with both arms, and we are doing what we can with our money and our time to make sure we solve the problem. If you look at our commitment at CPChem, we are a founding member of an organization called the Alliance to End Plastic Waste. We've contributed $15 million in the first year to circulate Capital's Ocean Fund. There's a team that's growing, and the commitment to this organization is got clear focus. And you can see that this organization has probably become the largest in the world in terms of solving this problem. This is the list of people. Charter companies is now 47 wide, and you'll see every mix and match of those that are in our industry and associated industry, upstream and downstream. Lots and lots of money are being spent to focus on this. Again, this is an environmental problem, and it's an ethics problem in terms of what we do and how we operate, and it's something we are committed to solving. With that, I'm going to end my talk and let the questions flow if there happens to be any.
Okay, thank you, Kyle. That was great. We do have some questions. So, and you're welcome to send in more questions. I've grouped some of these. So we'll start off with what are some of the key differences in sustainability efforts you've noticed since you entered the company versus today?
That's a great question. I'm 30 years into my career, and I think we gave lip service to sustainability at best when I started my career in 1990. It certainly was it wasn't a word that was probably even used in that form. It was talking about conservation and obviously minimizing effluents and making sure you didn't pollute in the air. But it really didn't talk about life cycle issues, and it did not talk about when you design a system, how you build in sustainability metrics. And so we've come a long, long way in terms of raising this in a level of importance and realizing these resources are sacred and that we need to conserve them. And so it's a different industry by a long shot than it was when I started.
Okay, what is the line? You talked a lot about language and what should be in writing or not in writing. How much should a person document their activities or observations in writing, whether it's in private or in something shared with others?
All right, that's another good question. I mean, this kind of gets at the root of everything we've talked about is dangerous to do, and that you'll in my experience, good note taking is critical in how you operate in your business and whatever role you might have. I try to be as careful a note taker as I can. So it's a fine line. You want to be deliberate in what you're trying to document. Obviously, people work differently. Some people need the organization of a lot of notes, but I think my guidance would be you have to really think about everything that comes off your pen or your typing, and be very careful what you're documenting. It shouldn't be conjecture. And again, stick to the guidance here in this presentation. I wouldn't say shy away from being a note taker, but it's so much more important with the guidance of our society these days, and how we approach being litigious and looking for chinks in the armor.
Okay, and another language question. What is the line between using neutral, unobjectionable language and using weasel words? We frequently condemn politicians and lawyers for purposefully and non-answering or evading a question. Equivocation is generally regarded as a bad character trait and not without good reason. How do we balance the duty to express the virtues of honesty, clarity, and forthrightness with a company's need for carefully worded diplomatic language?
Boy, somebody thought about that one for a long time. I appreciate
Yeah.
that. And it's coming on the heels of a political debate, which I choose to not even acknowledge in this setting, but it's a great question. I think honesty is critical, and we expect honesty and transparency. It's all part of the whole ethical equation. Again, I'm going to be probably less clear than someone wants in response, because again, it's all in the gray, right? You want to be all of those things, and you also want to be very careful what you document. The lawyers in our company would tell us, pick up the phone and make every conversation you have as a phone conversation. And we know that's not practical. We know that we need to have the ability to document. We need to have the ability to speak our minds and speak our truth. And that's, again, there's a fine line between that. I would say verbal communications are where what you've described is where that kind of space can be. Certainly not in writing. I think if you want opinions, and even if it's the way you feel, and you feel like there's controversy there, it's best done in the spoken word and not in writing.
Okay, you mentioned Chevron Phillips operates in a safety culture. What does a safety culture mean?
So one thing I'm proud of is that when we've had interns that come to work for our company that have worked for other companies, and this isn't about putting us on a pedestal or anything, they in their exits, the thing that they've said most often and that's resonated with them is how absolutely indoctrinated they've become to our safety culture from the day they walk through the door as just an intern. And if you look at our safety metrics, which I didn't include a graph, and we've driven ourselves, we're in the top 5% of our industry space in terms of OSHA defined metrics. So it's a tenet. It's the first tenet that we have to achieve before we begin to operate our business. And if we violate that tenet, then we don't have any business being in this space. So it's we live it, we breathe it. Sustainability has become that second tenet that is creeping up and being as important as safety to us, but safety still remains the number one thing that we speak to in this company. It's going to be in every presentation. We open every meeting with a safety moment. We recognize safe behavior, and we condemn unsafe behavior.
Okay. Okay, this is not an uncommon situation in the modern world. You mentioned that you are married to a person that works for a competitor. Do you have to do anything special to avoid violating the antitrust laws or other laws you discussed, since you have a personal relationship with someone who works for a competitor?
Great question. She used to work for Chevron Phillips, so it made things a lot easier. But but now she works for BP. And so it would be very, very important that both of us would disclose what the spouse was doing if we were in a competitive situation. She was in a role where she was overlooking midstream, upstream activities, where I was all dealing with downstream activities. And then, if you read in the press, BP just has effectively sold their petrochemical space, their chemicals downstream. So yes, there's definitely things to consider there, and make sure that that you adhere to. There is spousal privilege, and I won't get into the specifics on that, but clearly no company's going to feel comfortable if their spouses are working in a direct competitor role in another company. So it's something you do have to be aware of.
Okay. How should a student prepare during their college years for the professional world?
Wow, that's a wide open one here. I think, part of, you're making choices along the way in your entire college education, right? You're deciding what kind of career program or engineering program you want to study. You started with hopefully something in mind, but you're shaping that as you move forward. At some point, you're going to want to understand what kind of industry potentially you want to work in. We don't all have those choices, right? We're looking for a good job, and sometimes you don't have the luxury of saying, I'm going to work in exactly the space that I'd like to work in. Again, I get back to my experience at KU and say that I didn't do anything special other than realize that the educational program that I was engaged in was my focus at the time. Did not know it until I entered the workforce, but it served me incredibly well to compete in the field of engineering that I studied. So to me, this is an individuality issue, and it's hard for me to prescribe a pathway. Everybody needs to be their own person. They need to trust the education they're getting, and they need to be comfortable. I think maybe the one thing that comes to mind is I knew people in my curriculum that weren't sure they wanted to be engineers, but they were just gutting it out and trying to get through the program, and that was difficult for them, because at the end of the day, that then translates to, I got to go get a job with this, and I'm not even sure I like what I did. So I'd say be true to yourself. Make sure that you're doing things for the right reasons. The schooling process or the educational process isn't all fun every time you take a test and every class you take, but if you're committed to this space, it will serve you well, and it will set you on a great career.
Okay, one more. You have discussed professional and ethical behavior in a corporate setting. Okay, Chevron Phillips has operations around the world. How do your professional and ethical practices vary in different cultures, or do they? Does Chevron Phillips adapt to the local culture, or does it have one culture independent of where it operates?
Really good question. It's fair to say that we have different cultures in different places where we operate. Our European headquarters has got 17 countries that represent the employees that work there, and it's probably our most diverse setting. Our Asia headquarters obviously has its own culture, and our U.S. business clearly. We do operate in business units that are globally controlled, and we happen to be in a structure where most of that top level management is right here in the Woodlands, Texas, where I work. I would say while the cultures are different, the ethical and code of conduct and expectations for operations are absolutely aligned. And again, this makes things incredibly difficult when you're operating in countries that don't have the same laws or expectations in some cases as we do in the U.S. But we're a U.S. company, and we have to adhere to U.S. laws in everything we do. And so that becomes a challenge at times, trying to make sure that every employee is educated to what those circumstances are. We cannot violate U.S. laws of any kind, no matter where we're operating in the world. So, very good question.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Kyle. That's been a really good presentation. Appreciate you taking the time to put this together. We appreciate everybody for watching and listening and for the questions we had. And we appreciate the Engineering Advisory Board for sponsoring this series. Would encourage you to share it with your friends. The link, the recordings are again available on the School of Engineering homepage on YouTube. And with that, thank you again, Kyle. Thanks everybody for attending. And this concludes our presentation.